Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to talk to Dr. Nazir Khan. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, pal, and thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. I understand you're calling from the You are here from the Toronto area of
That's
Canada,
right.
and I'm in London, so it's great to talk to you from there. And Dr. Nazir Khan is a medical doctor and a volunteer imam, clinical neuroscientist, Islamic theologian, and specialist in Qur'anic sciences. He is an assistant professor at McMaster University. He's also a doctoral candidate in Islamic theology at the University of Nottingham here in the UK. Now, Nazir is the author of a truly fascinating article titled Atheism and Radical Skepticism, Ibn Taymiyyah's Epistemic Critique, which I found to be hugely beneficial in debates with atheists and radical skeptics. So I'm particularly thrilled that you should be presenting on this today. I think it's a very important article, which I've linked to in the description below. So do read it if you're not familiar with it. So you're going to do this presentation on your critique of atheism and radical skepticism. So over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Paul. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So if we can just get the slides up, and then I will take it away from there. All right, so as you've mentioned, Paul, this is a presentation that is based on a article that was published by Yaqeen Institute on atheism and radical skepticism. And the article itself is 50 plus pages. So this is a little bit of a summarized version. But in addition to that, it also includes some of the material from my doctoral work on Islamic theology at University of Nottingham. And so there's going to be some material in here that was not discussed in the article as well. So for those who have read it, there'll be something new. And for those who haven't, it'll give a good summary and introduction to the article, which they can refer back to for further information. So just to kind of provide a broad outline of what we're going to go through today, we're going to start by talking about what is epistemology and the importance of the topic of epistemology. And we're going to talk about Aristotelian logic as an epistemic system versus the Qur'anic epistemology, right? So what is the epistemology that the Quran offers in terms of how we establish knowledge? And the central question that we're going to be looking at is, do we need philosophical proofs for God's existence? One of the things that we're going to talk about is how the problem is not that there's a lack of proof for God. The problem is having an incoherent epistemology, and that's where the confusion comes from. We're going to talk about the Islamic tradition and what scholars in Islam have mentioned about the nature of belief in the existence of God and the concept of the Fitra. The Fitra is an Arabic term for sound human nature, or the natural inclination or natural tendency of human beings. And we're going to review some of the statements of scholars from the Islamic tradition. Then we're going to go into more detail on this phenomenon of radical skepticism, or safsata, as it's known in Arabic in the Islamic tradition. And we're going to talk about why using the methodology of attempting to prove things through Aristotelian logic, through philosophical argumentations, as an epistemic system actually leads and contributes to radical skepticism. And we're going to talk about specifically how atheism is a form of radical skepticism. And then once we've deconstructed that faulty epistemology, we want to present people with an alternative, and that's going to be the alternative which is rooted in the Qur'anic epistemology, and that focuses on the message of Islam and the Islamic answer to the purpose of life. So that's an overview of what we're going to talk about. And just to get into a little bit more of an introduction, so if anyone's had conversations or debates or encountered debates between theists and atheists, it's very common that an atheist may say something like, "Prove to me God exists," right? Sometimes atheists will resort to quote unquote positive arguments to try to prove their case, and such as arguing against the existence of God by referring to something like problem of evil or some other kind of challenge to the concept of belief in God. But most often, the most frequent defense of atheism is an appeal to lack of evidence for the existence of God. A lot of atheists will say something like, well, I just haven't encountered any proof. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to take an approach to suggest that there's a parity between the atheist saying, prove to me God exists, and a solipsist saying, prove to me that you exist. Now, what is a solipsist, right? A solipsist is somebody who believes there are no minds other than his own. So on the right, you see a picture, an image, which is actually the cover image for the article. And it shows somebody with a virtual reality headset on. And this idea has been featured in many different examples in popular culture. You have the idea that how do we as human beings know that we're not plugged into a matrix, that the entire world around us is just an illusion? Or how do we know that we're not in some kind of inception of dreams, one dream embedded in another, and it's all just a hallucination? And the key thing is no amount of philosophical arguments you provide a solipsist can convince them that the idea that the world exists is real, because they've already come to this position of radical skepticism. They've already nullified the very possibility that their position could be wrong. And that leads us to a question of epistemology. So epistemology is, how do I know my beliefs are true? And what is truth? What is belief? What are the different types of belief? And what beliefs require proof? And what types of proof are there? What kinds of beliefs does it make sense to doubt and demand proof for? And what kinds of beliefs does it not make sense to doubt and demand proof for? I remember reading a contemporary epistemologist writing on the subject, and his article opened with a very interesting statement, which was, prove to me that you're not an orangutan. And if you think about this kind of thing, prove to me that you're not a crocodile or a dolphin. I mean, it's just bizarre. And a person wouldn't need to say, well, I don't have scales that are green and a crocodile has scales that are green, or I don't have the jaw of a crocodile, or I have less teeth or something like that. You could offer that kind of proof, but you don't need that to know that you're not a crocodile. The totality of your experience as a human being would be completely meaningless if that kind of proposition were true. And so
it's an axiomatic truth then.
It's an axiomatic truth.
We are human rather than a crocodile. It's self-evident. It doesn't require extended proof and evidence.
Absolutely, Paul. Yeah. So what we're talking about now is that people can present all kinds of doubts, right? Doubts that you've never encountered before, that you never thought to question whether I'm a human being or an orangutan or a crocodile or something like this. When do you actually need to go back and start to have uncertainty about something and start to demand and search for proof in order to verify that something is true? So we've talked about epistemology more generally, and then we talk about epistemology of religious belief. So this is an entire discipline where we talk about, once you understand the question of what is proof and what is truth and what is belief, how does that pertain to religion? How do I know that my religion is true, for example? How do I know that God exists, right? Or that a particular religious doctrine is true? And again, I'm just going to kind of present the questions, and we're going to answer them in the course of the presentation. So one of the questions that comes up is, how do we acquire religious conviction, right? How do we acquire yaqeen, or certainty in our faith? Is certainty acquired through an accumulation of philosophical proofs, or is there some other process? And again, I want to suggest that there's a parity between religious beliefs and other foundational or fundamental convictions, including moral convictions, for example. So, for instance, if you look at the contemporary situation with the genocide going on in Gaza, at this stage, what is it going to take to convince somebody? Is there, a philosophical argument that somebody hasn't come across that's going to convince them that the killing of children is immoral? Or is it the case that all the information and evidence is there, but what we're dealing with is a dysfunctional thought process, something like dehumanization of Palestinians? If you can participate in a process of thinking in ways that dehumanize Palestinians, then perhaps no amount of philosophical proof is going to be enough to convince you that 10,000, 15,000 Palestinian children being killed is something immoral. And so that's where we have to challenge this kind of idea, that where the assumption is, well, if somebody hasn't Well, if somebody hasn't believed yet, it's just because the matter hasn't been settled on the basis of evidence. In fact, the proofs could be very clear and apparent, but the ways in which people choose to think about them, the ways in which people are approaching epistemology, there could be even moral failures that are attached to the ways in which people are blinded to certain truths. So when we talk about what kind of belief is belief in God, in the English language, when we use the term belief, it's non-specific, right? The term belief can refer to anything like, I believe I have 3 coins in my pocket, or I believe that I left the keys to the car at home, or something like that. But when we say I believe in God, or in Arabic, when we say I have iman billah, right? I have iman, faith, that is something much more foundational. That is something that structures the way in which we interpret all of our existence. That is something that is foundational to our worldview. That ties in with our moral development, our spiritual outlook on life. So all of that is attached to that concept of belief in God. So does it even make sense to compare it to the kind of mundane propositional beliefs that one talks about in ordinary life? And the other question that needs to be discussed is the question of whether finding the truth of a religion is analogous to something like solving a mathematical formula. And on the slide, we see an example of actually Kurt Gödel, the Austrian logician's proof for the existence of God, his modal argument for God's existence. And is that what belief in God is about? Is it about finding and discovering some kind of convoluted mathematical formula that's finally going to settle the debate? And if that is the case, then how can belief possibly be considered a moral responsibility, something that we as human beings are accountable for? If somebody doesn't solve a mathematical formula correctly, you don't say that there was some moral failure there, right? So there's a problem with this epistemology of religious belief that kind of reduces belief in God's existence to a matter of philosophical argumentation, and assumes that we need to have philosophical proofs to establish the existence of God. So that's a little bit of introduction to the topic. And I want to further highlight just how relevant this topic is to so many different other subjects that a person might be interested in. So if a person is interested in Islamic theology or aqidah, they may have the question of, how do we know our beliefs are true? How do we come to possess yaqeen, certainty, and repel shak or doubt? What is the nature of truth? This also has da'wah implications, or how we present the message of Islam to others. Is our methodology in articulating the truth of our faith to go searching for external confirmation, to talk about the Big Bang and the cosmological proof for the existence of God, and then we start debating back and forth with astrophysicists about the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and these kind of things? Is that what presenting Islam and the message of Islam looks like? Or is it centered on explaining how the Islamic message provides the most compelling understanding of life and of our purpose in life, and answers the big questions of life, the moral questions, the spiritual questions, the intellectual questions? This also has relevance to the topic of people encountering a crisis of faith. If somebody says, I want to be a believer, but I'm experiencing a spiritual crisis because I've come across a certain verse or hadith, a certain text that is giving me doubts, it begs the question, why is it that one person is able to read the same verse and their faith increases, and somebody else reads it and they have doubts? And maybe you answer that doubt and you explain to them, well, actually, this verse has this context, this is what it's talking about. And then the next week they come with another verse or another hadith that's giving them doubts. And I think everybody's kind of encountered that phenomenon where you realize every time you're answering the question, the root cause of the crisis of faith is not that particular verse. It's an underlying problematic mindset that induces doubt.
And I think we've all met people like that. I certainly have, who apparently innocently propose a particular problem. You say, well, let me see if I can help you with that. Here's a possible solution. And then you realize they come back with another problem and another problem and another. And in fact, they're almost disposed to throw up problems after problems after problems. So there's something much deeper going on than merely going through a list of issues they have. You're right. And as you say, there's a more fundamental problem with their mindset or their epistemology or understanding of revelation. And until that is tackled, they're just going to go on this spiral of endless, or treadmill of endless issues.
Exactly. And, I've even encountered scenarios where somebody asks a question and I haven't even finished explaining the answer. And before they've even understood the answer that I'm trying to explain to them, they're trying to think of a way to object to it and to argue against it, right? And that's just, human psychology, when people get trapped in that psychology of doubt, where they're not able to break that cycle of assuming that suspicion and distrust is a way to procure knowledge. So this topic is also important for people interested in Quranic studies or ulum al-Quran, because what we're going to talk about is, how does the Quran establish the truth of Islam? And what does a Quranic epistemology look like? And does the Quran address atheism? I remember, many years ago, hearing a popular Muslim preacher. He was asked a question, does the Quran address atheism? And he said, no, it's not an important topic. The Quran doesn't address it, which is actually not true. The Quran addresses it, but it doesn't address it superficially. It doesn't address merely the symptoms, but it addresses the underlying etiology or the underlying diagnosis that contributes to those symptoms, which is radical skepticism. So as we're going to see in the presentation, the Quran addresses it not superficially, but substantively. So this highlights kind of the relevance of the topic. And just to further emphasize the overall thesis, so this is right from the start of the article itself. At the beginning of the article, I mentioned the essential idea at the core of this essay is the following: philosophical proof is not required in order to believe in God, nor to justify one's belief in God. That doesn't mean that people are not to be persuaded by some sort of explanation or justification. The justification offered must primarily focus on Islam's message regarding the purpose and meaning of life. So that's the thesis, right? So it was interesting to see how people misunderstood that, or glossed over that important point, where the question is not, is it fitra versus rationality, for example? You are providing a rational explanation, but that rational explanation is grounded in the fitra, and we'll explain how that works as well. So one of the other things that's mentioned at the outset of the article is that people can entertain doubts about all sorts of things. Just as a person does not need philosophical proof to rescue them from the idea that the physical world does not exist, which is the idea of solipsism that we mentioned, or from the idea that moral values do not exist, and this is an idea that philosophers have talked about, moral abolitionism. Good and bad. We don't have any sensory evidence. We can't see good and bad. We can't hear it. We have no physical detection of it. Why do we believe in these things? The philosopher Richard Gardner wrote an article saying that fellow atheists should abandon belief in morality just as they abandon belief in God's existence. So this idea, that moral values do not exist, or that the physical world does not exist. These are examples of radical skepticism. And just as we don't need to demonstrate the logical impossibility of these views through some type of philosophical proof, in the same way, we don't need philosophical proof to escape atheism. There is a fallacy then, or an error in reasoning, in thinking that we must necessarily doubt and demand proof for something before it can be established as veritable truth. So here I want to... Yes, go ahead.
Just interject there. It's slightly off subject, but it occurred to me when I was reading your article, my first reading of it, that you're attacking the theoretical basis or the philosophical assumptions of radical skepticism and atheism, and that's very good and valid. But it might be that, I've read psychological studies that show for a large proportion of atheists that their disbelief in God is due to being angry with God or some kind of traumatic event that has made them doubt the existence of God. So it could be, even a divorce, they've lost a job, they're just angry with God. And the opposite, many people have said, and I think it's true, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. When you're so angry with God, the worst thing you can do in this kind of emotive state is to obliterate his existence from your mind. But the hatred is still there for many atheists. And I've noticed this when we often speak to atheists, they are really very psychologically engaged in refuting God all the time. They're not dispassionate. They're very much emotionally engaged. And that might betray some kind of psychological event in their own past, which has led them into disbelief. And the issue here, although I'm with you on the theoretical level, it's not for a lot of people a theoretical issue. It is a heart issue. Their heart has shut down or become hard, and the solution is like spiritual therapy, really, or God's grace, actually, to be a better way of putting it. Do you see what I mean? So I think,
absolutely. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because what that highlights is that, people appeal to certain justifications to back up their atheism. But when you examine those theoretically and you see that they're all kind of founded on radical skepticism, you're able to see that these justifications don't hold up. Then you sweep those away and you say, well, what's really the issue here? What's really motivating this kind of disbelief? And it could be, for someone, indifference. The Quran calls that ghafla, right? Heedlessness. A person is just kind of immersed in gratification of desires. The entertainment industry is a massive industry in society, right? That just keeps people in a perpetual state of heedlessness, so that the even thoughts of spiritual purification or moral prosperity or pursuing truth or pursuing the divine don't even arise in the mind, because a person is so constantly bombarded with distractions. And then it also could be, as you mentioned, it could be people are traumatized by their religious upbringing. So there's a really great discussion by the Toronto psychologist John Vervaeke, called "Awakening from the Meaning Crisis," and he has a podcast series where he talks about how there is this contemporary meaning crisis amongst people today. A massive rise in a variety of mental health disorders associated with this meaning crisis, where people are searching for answers, trying to understand what makes my life worth living, what is the purpose of life, and they're not finding answers. And he says, well, traditionally these answers come through religion. These are meta meaning systems, or meta systems of meaning, and we can't get those answers now because many of us are traumatized by our religious upbringing. So we have to try to create a new system, which is a religion of no religion, right? So people are recognizing that there are these factors that have pushed people into disbelief. And you mentioned also the hatred of God. That's an interesting one, because there's the term for that, misotheism, is very, very interesting. We see that there has been a cultural shift, actually, just in the past 10 years. So we had, in the previous decade, we had new atheism rise and then just suddenly fall, right? So new atheism, they had their annual conferences or massive conferences in Australia. The second one that they tried to organize, they had to cancel it due to lack of registration. People just weren't interested in showing up.
And one of the very prominent atheists, I forget her name, she recently converted to Christianity as well. And there was that debate between her and Richard Dawkins, who was aghast that she had betrayed the atheist cause and embraced God.
And so one by one, we see many people who have kind of distanced themselves from the new atheist movement and realize that it's a lot of pent up frustration against maybe their own religious baggage that they were exposed to, but it's not providing them with any meaningful understanding of the answers to life. It's not providing them with any solutions. It's not giving them a coherent epistemology to avoid radical skepticism, for example. And so because it doesn't provide any solutions, people end up drifting away from it. Yeah. There's another reason why there's been a shift from atheism to misotheism, though, which is that there's also been this shift between liberalism to postmodernism. Oh. So under liberalism, the idea is that rationality is going to determine what is the truth, and therefore it makes sense to have a debate between a theist and an atheist. But now with postmodernism, truth is relative. There is no objective truth. There is no universal truth. There is no grand narrative.
Although I must insist that everyone now points out, to say that there is no ultimate truth is a statement about ultimate truth. It's a self-refuting claim. You can't say this is the truth, but there is no truth.
Right.
It's an elementary absurdity. You can't have it both. You can't have your cake and eat it.
And all of these ideologies, as we'll see, are inconsistent and self-refuting in many ways. But with postmodernism, it no longer made sense for somebody to be a passionate atheist. So what happens is instead people just start to say, well, I just don't like the idea of God, right? That the idea of misotheism became more popular, and you actually see it and presented in popular culture, in movies, television shows. The idea of, oh, why are you going to let a religion dictate how you live your life, or why do you have to listen to God? Who is he to tell you how to live your life? These kind of ideas end up being promoted, right? So it's no longer a question of truth. It's just a question of, well, indifference or apathy or hatred, right? So coming back to the question of radical skepticism, we mentioned that the presumed justification for people's atheism is that, there isn't this kind of proof, and therefore, we people say we should deny the existence of God. And we're going to show how that's linked to radical skepticism. But one of the things that I want to do is take that back a little bit and show how there is a faulty epistemology underlying that. This idea, which Muslim scholarship encountered in the form of Aristotelian Avicennian epistemology, the idea that all of knowledge is either tasawwur, which is concepts, or tasdiq, which are assents or affirmations or assertions. And the only way to have knowledge of assertions is to have a syllogism. Of course, there are, a syllogism, by the way, is a logical deductive argument. So there are, of course, other ways of getting those assertions. People might point to mass transmission of knowledge, or reliable testimony, or sensory data. But when we're talking about belief in the existence of God, basically people are talking about just logical deductive arguments. So then you have this idea that the existence of God must be proven via syllogism, and any counter arguments need to be addressed, or when certainty is tentative. What do I mean by this? Alvin Plantinga wrote in one of his works that it seems absurd that a person should take this evidentialist approach, where they assume that you have to settle these philosophical debates in order to have a belief in the existence of God, because it's basically suggesting that, every time he said Anthony Flew, who at that time was an atheist, Anthony Flew comes out with a new book, I have to read that book to know what are his counter arguments to my arguments, or else I can't have certainty in my own faith. Or, for example, somebody saying, well, you can't really know whether God exists until you read all of William Lane Craig's discussions on cosmological proof for the existence of God. And then you have to read Graham Opie's books refuting those arguments, and you have to keep going back and forth. And if you don't do that, your faith is still tentative, because you haven't fully proven or worked out the logical impossibility of the counterfactual, right? So this is the faulty epistemology. And by the way, this doesn't apply to any other aspect of human knowledge. Like, people understand for any other aspect of human knowledge, it would be irrational, frankly, to try to proceed in this manner. You couldn't have knowledge of anything. And therefore, that approach, in this case, it leads to atheism. But if you were to try to apply this broadly, it would just be radical skepticism. It would entail radical skepticism if you tried to apply the same methodology. Anytime you encounter somebody who has a disagreement with you on any issue, you now have to doubt your belief, demand proof for your own belief, and then if they have an argument, you have to have a counter argument to their argument, and then keep going back and forth until it's completely settled. So that's where a lot of the confusion comes in.
So you're saying there's like a selective skepticism about
yes,
fundamental domains of reality, most of which we just accept without having to demonstrate proofs and syllogisms and so on and so forth. They are axiomatic. But in certain domains, the domain of the religious epistemology, suddenly this extremely high level of proof and evidence and argument is required. And you're saying this is an inconsistent methodology, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And people do this in whatever topic that they have a personal bias towards, right? So I'm going to accept whatever information, comes from this source because I like it. But if for example, if somebody is a anti-COVID, anti-vaxxer or conspiracy theorist, then I will apply radical skepticism to everything that comes about science, right? Or if somebody's talking about the genocide in Gaza and they'll say, well, we can't trust the numbers. No, we'll apply radical skepticism there. Right, but you flip the standards and you talk about any other element, and you see like what's going on here. Sometimes you accept certain sources unquestioningly, and other times if it disagrees with something you like, or disagrees with your own political interests, you apply this radical skepticism. So people are selective and inconsistent in their radical skepticism in many domains.
Right.
So now we want to come to the Qur'anic epistemology. So we discussed a little bit about the problematic epistemology, which is radical skepticism. So let's come to the Qur'anic epistemology of religious belief, and let's actually try to understand, how does the Qur'an teach us that the truth is to be pursued? And is the problem an insufficient amount of evidence, or is it a moral failure to pursue the truth? Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned before, what the Quran does is it addresses the underlying psychological and epistemological phenomena which precipitate disbelief, right? So it doesn't address things superficially, it addresses the underlying psychological and epistemological realities that are causing people to have these notions of disbelief. So for example, when the atheist says, "Prove to me God exists," people right away jump to trying to answer the question, well, here's a proof, but they're not correcting the underlying epistemological failure, the problematic mindset. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways they could correct that is by saying, well, what would you accept as proof? Right? Yeah. What would you accept as proof? And I actually remember many, many years ago seeing a debate where an atheist said, "Prove to me God exists." And the theist said, well, what would you accept as proof for God's existence? And the atheist, thought about it for a moment, and he said, well, I would only believe in God if I saw him directly, which is a very interesting kind of response, because that's something the Quran mentions, right? The people of Bani Israel said to Prophet Musa, وَقَالُوا لَن نُؤْمِنَ لَكَ حَتَّى نَرَى اللَّهَ جَهْرًا. We're not going to believe in you until we see Allah directly. Right? Mm-hmm. So he said that, and the theist said, okay, so you're telling me if you actually saw God directly, then you would believe and you would abandon your atheism. And he thought about it for a moment. He said, well, actually, I would probably say that I'm just having a bad hangover, which is very interesting again, because the Quran mentions in Surah Al-Hijr, the 15th chapter of the Quran, even if we open to them a gate from the heavens and they continue to ascend therein, they would simply say, our eyes have only been dazzled. Rather, we are a people affected by magic. وَلَوْ فَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ بَابًا مِّنَ السَّمَاءِ فَظَلُّوا فِيهِ يَعْرُجُونَ لَقَالُوا إِنَّمَا سُكِّرَتْ أَبْصَارُنَا بَلْ نَحْنُ قَوْمٌ مَسْحُورُونَ. So this is an interesting point where the Quran is highlighting the attitude of radical skepticism. Even if you saw the most incredible proof, you see the gates of heavens open up and you ascend up into them, or in another interpretation, another tafsir, you see the angels ascending up into the heavens, you're still going to say we're hallucinating, right? This is just a spell. So what is the problem? Is the problem that you haven't seen sufficient proof? Or is the problem the underlying epistemology and mindset?
And can I add also, you say the atheist says, "Prove to me God exists," and indeed that's what they usually say. And I've noticed this is an opening strategy, because to basically set the burden of proof for the argument. And it's unless you're alert to that strategy, that you're easily going to fall into them, the atheists, setting the terms of the debate. Well, one could equally say, atheism is a metaphysical truth claim. It's a claim that the universe has no creator. What is your evidence for that claim? But please substantiate your claim with evidence and proof. And I've done that. I've jumped in straight away, and they immediately balk at that. Oh, no. I want you to tell me, prove to me that God exists. No, I'm sorry. Hang on. You're making an actual positive truth claim about reality, a philosophical claim. You don't get a free pass because you call yourself an atheist. Every philosophical position has, ideally, to justify itself. So how do you justify atheism? So there's a whole burden of proof argument. So I find that if you jump in at that beginning stage, you never get to the question, "Prove to me God exists," because you're arguing over who sets the terms of the debate, where the goalposts, everything else, and they don't like that at all. But it's a very common trick that they just jump in and put the theist on the spot.
Yes, exactly. The whole idea is putting the theist on the defensive, and that approach is actually built on an underlying fallacy. And if that fallacy is not questioned, we're just going to be going round and round in circles without actually dealing with the underlying issue. So if we look further at what the Quran says about the epistemology of religious belief, I mentioned this verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 55, where they said, "Oh, Moses, we will never believe you until we see Allah with our own eyes." Similarly, in Surah Furqan, chapter 25, verse 21, they say, those who do not believe that they are destined to meet us say, why have no angels been sent down to us? Oh, nara rabbana, or why do we not see our Lord directly? Indeed, they are far too proud of themselves, having rebelled against God's truth with utter disdain. So the Quran identifies that it is fundamentally a moral failure that leads to these bizarre demands, and the problem is actually the mindset rather than insufficient evidence. And there's, of course, a variety of passages in the Quran which mention why isn't a sign sent down, which, corresponds to this attitude of why can't I see the proof? And so, in Surah Al-Ankabut, the 29th chapter, it mentions, yet they say, why have no signs been bestowed upon him from his Lord? Say, the signs are with God, and as for me, I am but a plain warner. Now, I also want to take the opportunity to mention there is this book that has been written in Arabic, Al-Iman Fitra, which is a work by Dr. Umar Farouk Abdullah, American convert to Islam, interestingly written in Arabic, and there isn't an English translation, so that is only in Arabic, but it is a very comprehensive study of all of the verses of the Quran and hadith and statements of scholars related to the topic of the fitra. And so it's a very useful resource for people to check out as well, if you are able to read the Arabic. So now moving forward, again, looking at other examples from the Quran of the epistemology of religious belief, we find examples where there are certain demands for proof that are made, or the Quran mentions that even if a certain type of proof was shown to them, they still wouldn't accept it. So, for example, the Quran mentions if we had sent down a written message on parchment so they could touch it with their hands, the disbelievers would have been sure to say, this is nothing but obvious magic. In Surah Al-Isra, the 17th chapter, one of the things that's mentioned is the Quraysh came to the Prophet and they said, make rivers and gardens sprout up, all around us. Springs come out of the earth. Why don't you have a house made out of gold? Why don't you have a book that comes down from heaven? They came up with all these kind of demands. And, the Prophet is told to say, Subhana Rabbi, hal kuntu illa basharar rasula. Glory be to my Lord. Am I not a human being who's a messenger? In other words, the focus is on the message. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I should say, did have physical miracles, but these verses show us that the miracles are not required for people to have faith, and people will make demands for miracles as a result of their own radical skepticism. And so, looking at what the Quran mentions and what Allah says in the Quran in Surah Yusuf, chapter 12, verse 105, how many a sign is there in the heavens and on earth which they pass by unthinkingly and on which they turn their backs. وَكَأَيٍّ مِّنْ آيَةٍ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ يَمُرُّونَ عَلَيْهَا وَهُمْ عَنْهَا مُعْرِضُونَ. They just turn away from them. So that's the crux of the issue there. The signs are there. But how do you recognize the signs, understand their meaning, identify them appropriately, understand their significance? That requires having the correct epistemology.
It's interesting. Sorry, today the signs that we can observe and have access to are almost infinitely more than at the time of the Prophet himself, or even the centuries after that. Because we have telescopes, we have microscopes, we see cells, we see DNA. We see the most extraordinary, exquisite engineering and design in organisms and so on in the universe, which are signs of God's creative power. But so there's a superabundance of signs,
right?
More than ever before, arguably in human history, because of what science is disclosing for us, and yet many people pass by unthinkingly, as the Quran says.
Right. And I think a great example of this is the series of posts that you've done on #NoDesign, right? Where you show something in, an incredible feature that we see in the natural world, right? Of some microscopic level of detail in some organism. And, people just assume this sprung out of nowhere without the wisdom of the divine. And I think that's one of the examples of just looking and recognizing the signs everywhere.
Yeah.
And asking, is the alternative meaningful? Is there any other meaningful account of the reality of existence besides this? And Surah Al-Ra'd, the 13th chapter, mentions, again, the demand, why has no sign been sent down? And what's interesting about this verse is it punctuates it by mentioning, وَيَهْدِي إِلَيْهِ مَنْ أَنَابَ, that God guides those who turn to him. So there is a spiritual inclination that is required for a person to actually attain appropriate epistemology, to actually attain the truth. There has to be a sincere desire. And that's kind of what we see in everything, right? When it comes to the genocide in Gaza, a person at the end of the day may spend hours and hours debating with somebody from the opposite side and then say, well, at the end of the day, if a person does not wish to change their outlook, dehumanization of Palestinians, or their outlook of support for apartheid or whatever, if a person does not want to change that outlook, at the end of the day, you can only do so much. There has to be a willingness on a person's part. And in the same way, it applies spiritually as well. Now, the other interesting thing that we see in the Qur'anic epistemology of religious belief is that the Qur'an talks about the Fitra, as we mentioned earlier, the sound human nature, and explains to us that truth is what conforms to the Fitra. And truth is also what provides guidance or hidayah. So one of the things that's interesting in terms of the difference between the Qur'anic outlook on knowledge versus what we find that's common in modern culture, and certainly in Western philosophy, is that from the Qur'anic understanding, true knowledge is guidance, right? It's not mere data. It's not accumulation of information. It's guidance. It leads to something. It leads to intellectual growth, spiritual growth, moral growth. It leads to virtue. That's what true knowledge is. And so the Quran mentions in Surah Al-Rum, chapter 30, verse 30, direct your face towards the deen, the religion of God, inclining to the truth, adhere to the fitrah of Allah upon which he has created all people. Meaning this is the fitrah, the natural constitution, which God has made all human beings upon. There is no change in the creation of God. That is the correct religion, but most of people do not know. As well, the Quran mentions, the statement of the jinn in Surah Al-Jinn, that yahdi ila rushdi fa'amanna bihi, that this Quran guides to the right course. It guides to what is virtuous, and therefore we have believed in it. That's the epistemology of the jinn, right? They're looking at what the Quran guides to. Similarly, in Surah Al-Qasas, chapter 28, verse 49, the Quran mentions, bring some other book from Allah which is a better guide than both of them, meaning the Quran and the Torah. If you're actually truthful, I would follow it, if you can bring a better source of guidance. But the reality of the matter is the Quran contains the best source of guidance. It contains the answers that human beings need to attain true virtue, to attain moral and spiritual growth. And finally, in Surah Al-Jathiyah, chapter 45, verse 6, the Quran mentions, these are the signs of God that we recite to you in truth. So in what narrative after God and his signs will you believe? If you're not going to believe in this, what are you going to believe in? فَبِأَيِّ حَدِيثٍ بَعْدَ اللَّهِ وَآيَاتِهِ يُؤْمِنُونَ. Right? What are you going to believe in if you choose not to believe in this? And the Quranic commentator Al-Alusi, he mentions, this indicates that there is no bayan, no meaningful explanation, which is greater than the explanation that the Quran is providing, the message, the meaningful message that is being given, nor is there a sign more evident than this sign. So let's tackle a few misconceptions somebody might have at this stage. Somebody will say, well, why are you appealing to the fitrah? You can't convince outsiders to believe in the faith. If you appeal to the fitrah, they don't believe in the fitrah. So how is this possibly going to work? And there's a misconception here. We are not saying that you need to construct an argument and tell somebody, hey, guess what? We have something called a fitrah, and the fitrah tells us to believe, and therefore you should believe. That's not how it works. You don't have to convince someone to believe in the specific term fitrah. People can understand how and why some knowledge is axiomatic without even mentioning the Arabic term fitra, right? We gave the example of moral values being axiomatic, or the belief in that our world is not a hallucination. That's also axiomatic, right? So people can understand that there has to be axiomatic knowledge without ever mentioning the term fitra. And in fact, when someone asks about the meaning of life and they find Islam's answers compelling, that is their fitra doing the work, whether they choose to call it that or not. To give a medical example, you don't need to know that you have a pancreas in order for it to digest for you, right? You don't need to know about the function or the name or the anatomy of a particular organ in order for its function to work. And that's basically how it works with the fitra. If you have this faculty or this capacity of the fitra, which describes the normative, natural disposition of human beings, that's going to work whether you know about that term or not. And you know what's interesting is in recent months, we have thousands of people around the world who have been witnessing the genocide in Gaza and embracing Islam. And why is that the case, right? They haven't discovered some new philosophical argument for God's existence, but they're seeing the faith of the Palestinians, right? They're seeing the resilience of the Palestinians, and they're seeing and looking into the worldview that gives them that resilience and that faith. And they're inspired by that message, and they find that message compelling. So what is it? What is our explanation of why they find that message compelling? That's where we mentioned the fitra. That's our explanation of why they find the message compelling. But they don't need to know the term fitra in order to find that message compelling. So I hope that kind of settles that misconception, which does come up here and there whenever the term fitra is mentioned. One of the other things that we can point out here is that when we're explaining the fitra, as I mentioned, you don't need to mention or get somebody to agree that they have something called a fitra. Rationality necessitates that we accept some knowledge as axiomatic. So there are certain fundamental rational convictions that need to be in place in order for anything to make sense. So for example, if a human being chooses not to believe that there is such a thing as truth or falsehood, they're not going to be able to make sense of anything. You have to believe that there is such a thing as truth and that it is objective and distinct from falsehood. The idea that the world is intelligible has to be in place, right? The idea that our existence and our choices in life matter.
Well, can I just pause very briefly on the world is intelligible? I think it's such an important thing. I remember reading once that Albert Einstein, the great scientist, this is characteristic of genius, I think, that they see things which are in front of our noses, but they articulate them very powerfully. This idea that, isn't it remarkable that the human mind, through mathematics in his case, can actually understand the universe, that it is intelligible. And for him, that was a remarkable property of the universe itself and ourselves, that it is intelligible. So what we take for granted, he saw as remarkable. And I think it's an extraordinary insight, actually, that we take so much for granted as axiomatic as well. But in fact, a supremely intelligent mind would marvel at this phenomena and not take it for granted.
Right. And what you mentioned just reminded me of the book Cosmic Jackpot, or The Goldilocks Theory by Paul Davies, a cosmologist and astrophysicist, who said that, what's interesting is when you look at the fine-tuning in the universe, it's not just that the universe is perfect for the conditions of biological life, but it's perfect for the kind of life that is capable of understanding its perfection. And he says that's something that's really extraordinary. And when you ask, physicists about this, or you ask people about this, there's a lot of hand waving, and where people say, well, that's just how it is, and there's no need for a further explanation. And he wrote a New York Times article, I think it was in 2006 or 2007, about this, where he said, taking science on faith. And he said this idea that, everything that we learn about in science just exists reasonlessly, that there's no underlying deeper explanation, is deeply irrational. And it kind of nullifies the very idea.
And unscientific as well.
And unscientific, I was going to say. It actually nullifies the very idea of science. And he says, in order for science to work, it actually required, and actually came out of a theocentric worldview, the idea that God created and ordered the universe according to the natural laws and fixed regularities. When we study the natural world, we understand that the universe is not playing tricks on our mind, that if I repeat an experiment tomorrow, I'll get the same results as if I did it today, that the natural laws are not changing, that they are fixed regularities that have been set in place by God. So that's something that, if somebody thinks deeply about the intelligibility of the world, they're able to see that. And the intelligibility of the world is not restricted to the empirical aspect that we study in natural sciences. It includes all aspects of the intelligibility of the world, the aspect of existence, of meaning, of purpose, of teleology. All of those aspects are also there as well. So that intelligibility has to be based in something, and it can't just be a happy accident, right? There's meaning and significance behind that. And that's connected with the idea that our existence and our choices in life matter, that there must be some purpose behind this. We are not the unintended consequence of blind, unthinking physiochemical processes. There is some meaning and purpose behind our existence. Otherwise, our choices just happen to be, attributable to different particles interacting in one particular arrangement or another. Mm-hmm. And then there are moral values as well, which are axiomatic. So the idea that justice is better than injustice, right? That is axiomatic to, for a human being. That is something that comes from the Fitra. Of course, it can be corrupted as people, fall prey to greed, selfishness, arrogance, their own interests. They may corrupt that natural intuition, but people recognize across civilizations that justice is better than injustice. And also the idea that our sensory experiences are not illusions. All of these are basic axioms that are rooted in human nature or the Fitra. To doubt and demand proof for these convictions is actually irrational, right? It's not that rationality demands that we always ask for proof. In fact, if you demand for proof and doubt something that is axiomatic, that is actually irrational and compromises your capacity to engage in rational evaluation. So, this other kind of misconception that I sometimes encounter is, well, if you're against philosophical proofs for God, that means you are against rationality in general, which is, of course, a logical fallacy, which is a non sequitur fallacy. But what it shows is that many people have been accustomed to think that rationality equals syllogistic reasoning, that all of rationality is just deductive argumentation. But if you actually come to the question from a cognitive science approach, and you examine, the full scope of what cognitive activities the human mind engages in, you realize that syllogistic reasoning accounts for a very slim, fraction of the majority of our rational activity. We have things like default reasoning, probabilistic reasoning, comparative reasoning, and any process that human reasoning is involved in is itself comprised of a variety of underlying processes. So we have perception, relevance realization, interpretation, abstraction, memory, pattern recognition, heuristics, conceptualization. These are all different things that are part of the human reasoning process. So when people, jump to a syllogism, one of the things that I find very interesting is all the most useful and significant and relevant parts of the human cognitive activity take place in deciding what to put into the syllogism. Once you actually construct the syllogism, then it's a very mundane, trivial issue. So the real value of your human reasoning is actually happening before that. It's actually happening in your relevance realization, in your ability to identify and abstract certain properties that allows you to categorize entities. And to do pattern recognition. That's where the interesting, cognitive processes are taking place. But also importantly, not only is it the case that human rationality is much broader than syllogistic reasoning, but we don't even need to undermine syllogistic reasoning in totality. We're just saying that syllogistic reasoning is not a prerequisite for knowledge about God. Right, and that's really the point here. So just like, when somebody negates scientism, right? If they negate scientism and they say scientism is a philosophically flawed position, the idea that all questions and all knowledge should be based on science and there's no other ways to attain any truths, that doesn't mean they reject science. They may reject scientism. It doesn't mean they reject science. In the same way, sorry.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, when I was at university studying logic, it occurred to me all the really interesting questions of life, whether it be a meaning, ultimate purpose, God, and so on. are not really answerable by syllogisms and logic.
They're not captured. Yeah.
With a very narrow framework, it can perhaps clarify certain logical moves, but it doesn't really produce much value. You have to step outside of that kind of rigorous logic to actually even understand the questions, of the substantive questions of meaning of life itself, value and purpose and God and so on. So I think it's actually quite a limited tool in that sense of giving us answers, although it has its uses in a much smaller domain, I think, in terms of clarifying questions and logic itself, I think.
Yeah, and this is actually something Ibn Taymiyyah it mentions in his work Ar-Radd ala al-Mantiqin, his refutation of the Greek logicians. He holds that there are two uses basically for syllogisms. Number one is if somebody has become so accustomed to this mode of reasoning that they wouldn't be convinced by anything else, then you can kind of present them with a syllogism. But he also says, number two, that it's a way to show somebody where they're contradicting themselves.
Yes.
Right? Where you kind of take somebody in a stepwise process, because really, and this is something that centuries after Ibn Taymiyyah, John Stuart Mill said the same thing, in his discourse on syllogisms. He mentioned that everything that's in the conclusion has already been affirmed in the premises. So what exactly is the new knowledge that a person is
exactly. And it's interesting to mention Ibn Taymiyyah, that I don't want to get sidetracked and talk about Salafis and so on. And it's not an anti-Salafi point at all, but a number of Salafis I have met, I don't think it's intrinsic to that position, but their absolute rejection of philosophy is ironic, given that Ibn Taymiyyah did actually say that it was permissible to use it on certain occasions. And just as you have said, when the person being spoken to will only understand the answer in those terms, and it won't be open to any other kind of persuasion. So it is actually permissible by Ibn Taymiyyah himself.
Yeah, so we have to clarify, he mentions it can be used as a conversational tool, but he clarifies that even when it's used in that way, it does not, the epistemic justification for belief in God is not based on that. It's just a conversational tool. And that's where I think people, get into a source of confusion.
But it's a nuanced position, I'm trying to say, his position, rather than simply a flat rejection of any philosophical discourse. There are occasions it can be, but it can't be, as you say, the basis for the epistemology.
Right. And we're going to look at, what he says in more detail in this presentation as well. So that's coming. Now, I want to give this example just to show, again, the scope of human reasoning and human thinking, and the different ways in which we look at things. And psychologists talk about the ways that humans engage in problem solving, looking at an initial state and a goal state and the path constraints. And that's one way that we look at a lot of problems in life. But here's another example, which is very interesting. So this is an example that, sometimes students are given in their psychology class, where they're presented with an example of a chessboard or checkerboard, and two squares from opposite corners are taken away, and the person is given the task of trying to cover the entire board with a series of dominoes and seeing if it's possible to do that. And, students will kind of go through and try different ways, and they realize, okay, I didn't do it properly. Then they start over and they try another way of doing it. And, there's a brute force way of trying to just go through multiple different ways of arranging the dominoes and seeing if you can do it. But the way to actually solve the problem and to answer the question, is it possible to cover the entire chessboard with dominoes without any overhanging edges or anything like that? The way to actually solve that is to note that every square has adjacent to it squares of a different color. Right? If we're talking about a chessboard, every black square has white squares next to it. Checkers, every black square has red squares next to it. And so when you take away the opposite corners, you've taken away two of the exact same color. And so there's no domino that is going to therefore cover the entire chessboard, because now you're left with an uneven number of squares of each color. And so when you look at the same problem using a different frame of reference or a different framework, different conceptual reference point, you engage in this process of relevance realization, right? You're recognizing a certain feature of the problem in front of you to be relevant to your analysis of the problem. And then that gives you this flash of insight where you're able to say, okay, this is actually how I apply this solution to this question. And what's interesting is the Quran describes its own guidance as insight, spiritual perception, right? So the Quran describes itself as basairu linnas, that the Quran is a source of insight for human beings. It provides you with new conceptual frameworks to answer and solve the questions that people are struggling with. It provides you with moral guidance, spiritual guidance, intellectual guidance. It's comprehensive in the approach that it's giving. And just like this chessboard, you can't present this type of thought process in a syllogism, right? I mean, there would be no way to do that. And so this idea that syllogism is the be-all and end-all of human rationality, it doesn't work in epistemology in general, but it especially doesn't work in the epistemology of religious belief. So just to kind of summarize this here, we have the Qur'anic framework, which is constructive. It builds up knowledge, right? And that is, to call the human being's attention to what is relevant in their reality and in their existence. And that's through the process of dhikr, of remembrance of what is relevant, what is meaningful, remembrance of God, remembrance of one's purpose in life, remembrance of the hereafter, and to awaken from a state of ghafla or heedlessness, to contemplate the objectives behind things. So that's the process of tadabbur. And Imam Shatibi, Andalusian scholar, he died 790 years after the prophetic migration, after the hijrah. He said that the meaning of tadabbur is actually contemplating the maqasid, or overlying objectives. And then there's the two modes of discourse the Quran frequently uses throughout, which is amthal, or comparisons or parables, and ayat, or reflecting on signs. So this is how the Quran provides us with a framework of building up knowledge in a constructive approach. Whereas if we look at using Aristotelian logic as an epistemic system, and again, we have to remember, it's not about criticizing the validity of the syllogism, the formal validity of the syllogism, as academics like Wael Halaq and others have pointed out. That wasn't the issue. It's using it as an epistemic system, as a system of knowledge. It's based on this idea of skepticism. Then all knowledge has to be justified through syllogisms if it's a claim, and if it's a concept, it has to be justified through a Aristotelian definition, right? And that just leads to finding more and more claims to be skeptical about. And so there are philosophers who have pointed out that all of philosophy is subtractive. There's a big question in philosophy: does philosophy actually lead to constructive knowledge, or is it just taking a problem and just, deconstructing it further and further? There's many books written about the meaning of life from a philosophical standpoint. And philosophers joke that most of the time the book will be talking about what each word in the question means. And by the end of the question, by the end of the book, you just end up with more questions rather than any answers. And so this subtractive approach or deconstructive approach doesn't actually lead to any growth in human knowledge. So now we're going to go through the scholarly tradition, and I want to highlight a few quotes. And one of the things I'm doing deliberately in this presentation, which is a little bit different from the article. In the article, I was focused on Ibn Taymiyyah, and I went through 95 citations and references from his work and really tried to bring out, his epistemology. And analyze it in detail. But I realized that also led to this kind of misperception among some people that this is just an idea that Ibn Taymiyyah had, and if people have a sectarian animus towards Ibn Taymiyyah, then this idea should be dismissed. And actually,
some people do have an animus towards him, scholars and lay people. But one of the things I was just, when I first encountered Ibn Taymiyyah, without any particular emotional baggage, to be honest, ideological baggage, because I don't really know who he was, I was just totally in awe of his sheer genius. I mean, the guy had an extraordinary mind, and he transcends eras. I'm not saying he's right about everything. I'm not saying he's the only scholar, far from it. But I think he's one of those remarkable human beings in the Islamic tradition. The equivalent in the Christian tradition might be someone like Thomas Aquinas, for example, or Augustine. Perhaps. And in other words, great titans in these traditions. And I was generally impressed. I still am very impressed with him, actually.
Right. And, that's something, many non-Muslim academics who study his work, like Wael Halaq and Anke van Kugelen, they mentioned that his critique of Greek logic is, they call it a stroke of genius, just like you mentioned. So this is something you don't even have to be a Muslim to appreciate that. But, therefore, I think the approach that we have to have is you take the best from everyone. No human being is infallible, as you mentioned, other than the prophets, right? And so, aside from the prophets, you take whatever right guidance and good contributions come from everyone, and we're all trying to find the answers and to guide people towards the truth. And so I think that kind of sectarian animus or polemical tones that people approach the subject with, it really doesn't belong here. I mean, a person is welcome to say, look, I disagree with this approach, and I think there's a better way. Here's how I would argue it, and that's fine. And that way we can have a space of collaboration. But the polemical undertones, I really think, degrades the discourse, and unfortunately, there's too much of that, still in the popular space. So, if we look at the scholarly tradition, and I deliberately selected, thinkers from a variety of different backgrounds to show, the breadth of this idea. So we have, for example, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, the founder of the Maturidi school of thought in theology, who mentions, and I'm just paraphrasing and summarizing in the interest of time, the quotations. He mentions the interpretation of the Fitra in the Quran includes the idea that we have been created with a natural inclination and an indication towards ma'rifah, or recognition of Allah's lordship and oneness. We have Abu Hamid al-Ghazali in his work Ihya Ulum ad-Din mentions that the prophets were sent to call people to the worship of Allah alone, and not to tell people that, hey, you know what, we have a God and this world has a God, right? Because that is something that is already ingrained in the fitra of their intellects from the beginning.
And can I just pause with that? I was just, before you came on today, I was just Googled some research was done at Oxford University. I was looking at the Telegraph here. It says, belief in God is part of human nature, Oxford study. And this refers to a project involving 57 academics in 20 countries around the world and span disciplines including anthropology, psychology, and philosophy, and funded by Oxford University. £1.9 million it costs. But put it very simply, belief in God is part of human nature, they discovered. It's not something that one acquires through religious indoctrination or being brought up in a family of churchgoers. It's children exhibit these attributes, this fitra, spontaneously and naturally, whatever the culture, be it Japan, North Korea, Texas, whatever, it's just universal. And this has been observed and researched scientifically now. So this is the case. The fitra has been validated by science, even though we don't need science to validate it.
And that's an important point what you mentioned at the end. So this whole discipline that you're referring to, this is called the cognitive science of religion. I deliberately did not include it in this presentation because I wanted to make it very clear to people that the argument does not depend on it. I'm not making an argument based on a set number of empirical studies that were done, but it is true. And it is something that I talk about in the article itself in more detail. And if people want to learn more about this, there is a book by Justin Barrett called Born Believers. And the book Born Believers by Justin Barrett, who's a psychologist, developmental psychologist, is very interesting because he talks about studies that are done with infants, with toddlers, with young children. And right from infancy, you can already see that babies have an expectation that things have a purpose, or teleology. Right? Babies follow a parent's gaze and see what they're looking at. They will spend more time looking at a picture that has the shapes moving around in a way that seems like a story with characters, rather than the shapes moving around in a haphazard or disorganized way. Mm-hmm. And as children grow up, as they're toddlers, you can ask questions to a 4-year-old about belief in God, and they can give you very reliable answers about the omnipotence of God, the omniscience of God. They have an understanding of these. And he mentions a story in his book where he was talking and interviewing children in a Scandinavian country where, the culture was overwhelmingly atheist. And the parents who were atheists were surprised that their child was giving, answers that correspond exactly with theology and belief in God. And the parents stopped for a moment and they said, they turned to their child and they said, Johnny, like, do you believe in God? And he's like, of course, mom and dad, right? He says this to his parents, who were surprised, as atheists, that their child growing up in the society just happened to believe in God's existence.
So atheism is an acquired belief later on, not religion. And atheism is the problem. To explain that psychologically or theoretically, it's a curiosity. It shouldn't really occur, because it's not natural and it goes against the grain of our natures. And it's also not true, but that's a philosophical point. But it puts the whole question in a very different way, I think, than seeing religion as somehow grafted into or onto the innocent child. It's the other way around. Atheism grafted onto the growing adult, usually.
Yeah, exactly. And one other thing about, I'll say one last thing about Justin Barrett's book is that in the book he mentions that, when I started publishing this research, I had all these Muslims emailing me and telling me that what I'm talking about is called the Fitra. And he's like, I think they're misunderstanding, because what I'm saying is not that people are born believing in a religion of Islam or belonging to a particular religion. But actually, that's a case of him not understanding what the Fitra is, because Muslim scholars do not say that the Fitra means somebody believes in the doctrines of Islam and they call themselves a Muslim. Rather, the Fitra means that they have the basic understanding that there is a creator, that there is, certain moral values, that there's a concept of justice and truth and these kind of things. So actually, everything that he explained is entirely in accordance with that understanding of the Fitra. Right. So moving on from Al-Ghazali, we also have Shahrastani, a heresiologist and philosopher, who talks about belief in the existence of God. And he says, I do not count this issue to be from the inferential matters, an-nadhariyat, that are to be substantiated with proof. In other words, you don't need to have a philosophical proof for the existence of God. He says, for verily sound human nature testifies necessarily by its nature and by its intuitive thoughts that there is a wise, all-knowing, and all-powerful maker. And he quotes the verse of the Quran in Surah Ibrahim, chapter 14, verse 10, where the prophets mentioned, "Afillahi shakkun fatiris samawati wal ard." The messenger said to their people, is there any doubt concerning Allah, concerning God, the creator of the heavens and the earth? And then we also have a quote from Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari, the Sufi thinker, who mentions there is a massive difference between the one who proceeds from God in his thought process, from God in his argumentation, versus one who proceeds towards God inferentially. So in other words, the one who uses God as his proof versus the one who uses creation to prove God. There's a big difference. So he says the one who has God as his starting point knows reality as it is, or knows God as he is. And he proves any matter by reference to its point of origin. He's able to make sense of reality by understanding that God is the foundation of everything. But he says inferential argumentation comes from absence of reaching him. Otherwise, when was it that he became absent such that one has to, doubt his presence and then try to reach him through these kind of arguments? When was it that he became distant such that the traces, the created things themselves are that which will unite us with him or bring us towards him? And this is actually something Shahrastani mentions as well. I didn't include the full quote of Shahrastani, but Shahrastani also says that it doesn't make sense to use what is less obvious to prove what is more obvious. And he mentions that many early Muslim thinkers would say things like, عرفت الأشياء بربي وما عرفت ربي بالأشياء. I came to know of other things through my Lord, rather than knowing my Lord through other things. So there's a concept of theocentrism, that God is the central foundation for making sense of everything in reality. Similarly, you have the Ash'ari Andalusian Qur'anic commentator Ibn Juzay, who mentions of the ways to know God's existence. He mentions the sound fitra testifies to the existence of Allah. And he says that every human being can recognize that this vast dominion must have a great sovereign, must have a wise designer to this wise design that we encounter in reality around us. This is just something that human fitra naturally testifies to, right? So that's something that has been mentioned as well. So you can see there's a wide selection of scholars. So even scholars who took the approach of kalam, of arguing using philosophical proofs, they did recognize that sound fitra is a way to testify to the existence of Allah. I will mention that there are some who denied that. There is an exception, but broadly speaking, many of those who took that approach still testified that the Fitra is a means of believing in God's existence. Nizam ad-Din al-Nisaburi, another mutakallim or kalam theologian, talks about how knowledge of a necessary being is something that is badihi, it's something that is self-evident, it's primordial, it's intuitive, it's from the Fitra. And he says, people have come to assume that because these philosophical works are filled with proofs of God, people think that belief in God's existence is a conclusion that has to be proven. But in reality, it's not. It is something that is self-evident and is a foundation for understanding. And he says the fact that the Quran engages in rational discourse and points out certain things doesn't contradict that, because people can be reawakened to knowledge that is axiomatic, that they have neglected. Right? And so that's another point, which is when you look at the Qur'anic discourse, of course, the Quran is not engaged in syllogisms, but the Quran is asking human beings to reflect on the purpose of life, for example, right? Those who remember God standing, sitting, or lying on their sides, and they look at the creation of the heavens and the earth, and they say, "Our Lord, you have not made all of this in vain." Right? This is not all meaningless. There has to be a purpose and meaning behind this in the 3rd chapter of the Quran in Surah Al-Imran. Right? So you see the Quranic discourse is reawakening people to knowledge that is axiomatic. And now I will say, lots of thinkers have mentioned this point, but one thing about Ibn Taymiyyah is he really goes into the greatest amount of detail on elaborating how this concept provides us with an entire epistemology itself, and how that epistemology is not dependent on Hellenistic philosophy or Greek philosophy. It is really something that comes out of the Qur'anic worldview. And what's really interesting is he does this from something as straightforward as looking at the very first verse revealed in the Quran. So he says that if you look at the very first verse revealed in the Quran, the verse of the opening verse of the 96th chapter, Surah Al-Alaq, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq." A verse every Muslim child has memorized. Recite in the name of your Lord. And what he points out is that a single letter in this verse basically nullifies the concept of atheism and provides us with the correct epistemology. What is that letter? It is the letter kaf. Right? When God says, "Recite in the name of your Lord," not recite in the name of the Lord. So it implies that the ones being addressed already have an intuitive understanding of who the God is that they are reciting in his name, right? Or the concept of God is known to us. It's rooted in our fitra. So that answers this fundamental misconception that people have, that belief in God is something that is nadhari or inferential, rather than daruri. It is axiomatic, right? And he points out that right from the very first verse in the Quran, we can see that belief in God is something that is axiomatic. He says, even though creation is a proof of existence, even though creation is a proof of God's existence, he's not denying that it is a proof of God's existence. The knowledge of God's existence is already known in the fitrah before this inference. Right, so that's how he articulates that point. Mm-hmm. And so right from here, again, I want to tackle this misconception. Are we saying the fitrah is a replacement for rationality? The answer is no. The fitrah is the foundation of rationality. The dictates of reason are rooted in the conceptual building blocks given to us by the fitrah. So people err in equating rationality with a specific activity, syllogistic inference. We already talked about that. But when I say that belief in God is rooted in the fitrah, just because knowledge of something is natural to human beings doesn't mean you don't have to think about it. Right? Just because knowledge of morality is natural to human beings doesn't mean you don't have to think about it. Right? There is still a rational process for embracing what our fitrah points towards. But the point is that we don't have to start by doubting everything, by going into this epistemological abyss, right? Or this digging ourselves deeper and deeper, where we just doubt everything and we try to find something that we can latch onto that is indubitable, right? Because at the end of the day, doubt is a choice, as the Quran indicates. Doubt is a choice, and certainty is a choice. It comes about from pursuing what is meaningful. So, and this is something, again, I'm not the only one who has written on Ibn Taymiyyah by any means. There's, a lot of great work that's been done on his epistemology. So Carl Sharif al-Tibghi writes that God is said to have fatara, or created or fashioned the uqul, the minds, the intellects of mankind in a particular manner, a statement that makes it quite evident that the Fitra for Ibn Taymiyyah closely overlaps with what we might call innate or intuitive knowledge, and fundamentally with reason itself. And I see you have the book.
Yes, I can't help but I really love it. He's a good friend now, Carl. But when I first contacted him, actually by email, I said I never met him before that point. I said, could you kindly come on Blogging Thought and talk about your marvelous work on Ibn Taymiyyah? He said, yes, I'll happily come along, but I want you to read my doctoral dissertation first. And he actually sent me this book. It's got a beautiful inscription inside.
Nice.
So I had to read it, and I'm so pleased he made me read it, because it was a real eye-opener. And then that was my real introduction into Ibn Taymiyyah's brilliance on Aql and Naql, of course. So I really, although this is not an easy read, it is very interesting read, compelling, I think, and I do highly recommend it if you want to get hold of it and really get to grasp with this whole idea of reason and revelation, which you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I absolutely agree. And one thing that I also want to clarify when if we mention innate or intuitive knowledge, it's important. Somebody could get the misconception that, does that mean that we're born with a database of information in our heads? And Ibn Taymiyyah is very clear that the Fitra does not mean that people are already born possessing knowledge of the faith of Islam or specific, details. Because God says in the Quran, وَاللَّهُ أَخْرَجَكُم مِّن بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ شَيْئًا. God brought you forth from the wombs of your mothers while you knew nothing. So rather, the Fitra is a natural tendency in the human being to come to know God, to love God. It develops within human beings in the absence
of impediments. That's an important caveat, because there are impediments sometimes, and so you're not going to always see the Fitra in operation in its pristine form. It's going to be corrupted, damaged, or even obliterated. I don't know if obliterated truly, but yeah, this is the problem. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's the role of revelation. The role of revelation and the sending of prophets and messengers is reawakening this natural faculty within human beings. So one of the other things that Ibn Taymiyyah does that's very interesting in his exegesis or commentary on Surat Al-Alaq, the 96th chapter, he has this interesting discussion on the conversation between Prophet Musa or Moses and the Pharaoh, Fir'aun. And one of the things he mentions at first, he explains that prophets were instructed to call their people to worship God, and they did not first try to obtain philosophical proof or convince their people of philosophical proof that God exists. Even when it comes to somebody like Fir'aun, who, as Ibn Taymiyyah mentions, the Quran is very clear, he denied the existence of the Creator, right? So he denied the existence of the Creator. He says to his chiefs, "Ma alimtu lakum min ilahin ghayri." I know of no God for you other than myself. He says to them, "Ana rabbukum al-a'la." I am your Lord, the Most High. He says to Musa, "La in ittakhadta ilahan ghayri la aj'alannaka min al-masjunin." I will, if you take a God other than me, I'll throw you in prison. Right. So he's very clear that he denies the existence of the Creator, at least outwardly. Right, even though his Fitra tells him otherwise. Now, what's interesting is Prophet Musa is instructed to call him to have taqwa, to be mindful of God. He's not told to first philosophically prove God exists and then call him to worship Allah. And what Ibn Taymiyyah draws our attention to is that when Fir'aun says, "Wama Rabbul Alameen," what is the Lord of the universe? What is Rabbul Alameen? He's not asking a question out of ignorance. He's not asking like, who is the Lord of the universe, or tell me about his attributes, but it's just an expression of denial. And Prophet Musa replies by saying, the Lord of the heavens and the earth, if you have any certainty, in kuntum muqinin, explaining that God is that reality that is too well known to be denied, too manifest to be doubted. And what's interesting is this phrase, if you have any certainty. So Ibn Taymiyyah says, whatever it is that you have certainty in, God is the first certainty, which grounds all other certainties, basically. So he says, now somebody might say, well, we don't have certainty in anything. What if we want to say, well, we just don't know anything, right? That is universal skepticism, or as-safsata al-amma, and he explains that nobody can coherently adopt that position. And the discussion continues, and he links this back with the Fitra. So one thing that's really interesting here is when he says God is the certainty that grounds all other certainties. He says that Prophet Musa did not say, he did not specify it. He did not say, if you are certain in this or that, like if you're certain that the sky is blue, or if you're certain that, you know, the earth is green or anything. He just left it unqualified. If you have any certainty. So whatever certainty you have in anything, the certainty in your Lord, the certainty in God must precede that certainty, just as the Prophet said to their people, is there any doubt concerning Allah? And if we try to understand how that is the case, how certainty in God grounds other things, we talked about certain axioms, certain things that are axiomatic for human rationality that it wouldn't make sense to deny, such as morality, such as rationality, such as causality, sense reliability, meaning, teleology. If you think about all these different things, these are themselves dependent on belief in the divine for their own grounding, right? If you replace belief in God with something else as your ultimate understanding of reality, like let's say you adopt materialism, as many atheists do, so you believe that we're just a collection of particles, then all of a sudden there is no such thing as good and bad. They're just different ways of arranging the particles. And you could say that you prefer one arrangement over another, but there's no sense in saying that one is objectively good or objectively bad. It's kind of like saying I prefer my eggs scrambled rather than boiled. It's just different arrangements of particles. Mm-hmm. So in order for any of these things to be meaningful, rationality, a reason why our logic corresponds to the truths of the universe. In order for this to actually be meaningful and to be grounded and not just to be suspended and hanging in midair, it has to be anchored in this understanding that God has endowed us with the rational faculties. God has created the universe according to, principles of natural laws and causal relations that he has structured the universe according to. He has embedded within us moral faculties and choices that have significance for our purpose in life, for striving to attain virtue. That he has granted us faculties of perception that do provide us with reliable knowledge of the external world, and that our existence is not pointless. Rather, we exist for a reason and purpose. So the choice for a human being basically is either you believe in meaning, you believe things are meaningful, right? You affirm morality, rationality, causality, sense reliability, and meaning. And if you want to take that pathway, in order for that meaning to be there, it has to be grounded in something deeper, which is belief in God. God is the foundation of all this meaningful construal of reality.
It's interesting, even, sorry, just to do a quick quote, but even people, interesting philosophers like Nietzsche have kind of recognized that. I remember reading Nietzsche once criticizing a brilliant English novelist, George Eliot, or Mary Ann Evans was her real name. It was a woman operating under a man's name because of the conventions at the time. You had to write like that. And she wrote, it was the most sublime literature in the English language, like Middlemarch and Mill on the Floss. Anyway, she was an atheist. And she kind of made it known. I mean, she wasn't hiding it. She didn't believe in God. And yet, if you read her novels, they are suffused with morality, good and bad, rationality, all these things. And it's quite a Christian morality that she operates in. And she has profound psychological perception of human motives and morality. So it's not cynical. She inhabits this Christian moral world. And Nietzsche, of course, being Nietzsche, she was a 19th century novelist. Nietzsche came along, died at the beginning of the 20th century, and really took her to task for not following through on her atheism. He said, look, you can't write like this. If you're an atheist, you must eschew, you must abandon this moral discourse, this sense of all the things that you got, the Fitra, because there is no God, he right. said. So he got the point, although he remained an atheist. But it's interesting that he attacked other atheists for not being consistently atheist, and in fact, borrowing on the Christian capital of our culture, of our civilization, so they can even articulate morality. But he says, no, you can't even do that. You must get rid of it all if you're going to be a true atheist. So I thought that was, he was another brilliant human being who unfortunately just got it wrong on the fundamental question, but nevertheless had an acute intelligence to see the point. Actually, I think what I would say about him is also that he was able to follow ideas down to their logical conclusion, right? Yeah. And so he saw that the end result of that approach is nihilism, the denial of meaning.
He said, well, you know what? If you're going to commit to that path, then you just have to welcome nihilism, right? And recognize there is no absolute meaning or whatever. But at the end of the day, it drove him mad, right? And so,
literally, yeah, this is a very tragic story.
So no human being can really go down the path of meaninglessness. And even for a person to say, "I believe in meaninglessness," to even say "I believe" is presumably you're affirming something because you believe it's meaningful, right? You believe your beliefs are meaningful, right? So even to say "I believe in meaninglessness" is a contradiction. You're on the one hand affirming meaning by making a statement of belief, but you're affirming meaninglessness, right?
Yeah, so it's saying all truth, there's no such thing as absolute truth. Well, you just made a statement about absolute truth here. There's no such thing, or all truth is relative. Well, you just made a statement about a truth, which is not relative.
Exactly.
That statement is not relative. Otherwise, it undermines its own claim. Yeah.
Right. So at the end of the day, really, if the choice comes down to pursuing meaning or choosing meaninglessness, then there's really no choice at all, right? The choice of meaninglessness cannot be coherently adopted. And so really, if a person is sincere and committed, and wants to pursue meaning and truth in their life and pursue the path of virtue, there is no other choice but to adopt a worldview that provides meaning. And so I think that's very clear. Again, just to fully make this clear, somebody might say, well, is this circular reasoning? God told me I have a fitra, therefore God exists, but I only know that God exists through the fitra. Again, I think it should be very clear at this point that that's not the case. We're not constructing a fitra-based syllogism. We're instead showing that there are certain conceptions that a human being must have: acceptance of causality, morality, logic, time, reality, truth. All of these are axiomatic concepts in order to make sense of anything. And all of those concepts are themselves dependent on that theocentric worldview for meaning. And so really there is no other meaningful outlook on reality which evades that. So now what I want to do is dissect radical skepticism itself in greater detail. And that's something that's called safsata, or radical skepticism. And it will further kind of emphasize and highlight some of the points that we've been making. So what is radical skepticism? So the idea behind radical skepticism is, if we doubt and demand proof for everything, that's the way that we're going to end up at knowledge, or even to say that we can't know anything for certain. So some radical skeptics will deny the possibility of knowledge. Some will say, no, there is knowledge, but we can't attain it without going through this procedure of doubting and demanding proof for everything. And what I want to highlight here is people can choose to doubt anything. So you can have reality skeptics, which is another word for solipsists. How do you know the world is not an illusion? You can have morality skeptics. How do you know there is such a thing as good and bad? You can have truth skeptics, right? Or postmodernists. How do you know there is an objective truth? You can have gender skeptics, right? How do you know there is male and female?
The new skepticism that's just come about.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, what skepticism does is it introduces to you a doubt in something that you would have otherwise never had any reason to doubt. So, a child growing up developmentally, may take for granted, like, okay, I know I'm a boy and whatever. But now all of a sudden you say, well, how do you know for sure? How do you really know that? And so instead of spending your time acquiring other knowledge or concepts, now you're spending your time in a phase of radical skepticism. It undermines knowledge that is otherwise axiomatic. And science skeptics, how do you know the earth is round? Genocide skeptics, as we mentioned, the genocide in Gaza, how do you know it really happened? How do you question every aspect of it, right? How do you know these numbers are true? How do you know these numbers are not made up? And, I think, when people were watching these debates in the early months of the genocide debates with Piers Morgan, for instance, people thought, maybe he's going to be convinced. Everybody's giving him the arguments, the evidence, everything. And then they realize, at the end of the day, he just continues to spout the same.
Or Jordan Peterson, who was given, a very high level dawah by, various very well known Muslim guys, and if anything, he's got worse. I mean, he's in terms of his support for genocide and attacks on Muslims. I mean, it's unbelievable. Those of us who actually look to him for some guidance on matters have now completely turned off from him. But I mean, I must push back slightly on this when you talk about this doubt, this skepticism. Of course, Descartes used methodological skepticism in his meditations, and the one thing he couldn't doubt was the fact that he was doubting, and that led to the cogito ergo sum. I think, I doubt, therefore I am. So in fact, his radical doubt reached for him rock bottom and became the basis for a new epistemology. Now, I'm not a Cartesian, but I've just thought at least that was the process he went through. His doubt itself became a turning point, because that suggested a self that was doubting, and therefore I think, therefore I am.
Right.
And then he went back again. So he had a limit to his radical skepticism.
Right. Well, what's interesting is that people have even examined that further and pointed out that you can even doubt that, because you can have mental state skepticism. How do I know I'm the one doing the thinking, rather than the thoughts being kind of projected or cast onto my mind?
Exactly.
And so I think that also kind of illustrates the point. The approach that Descartes had is that, if you have this basket of apples, I think people have given this analogy, you try to, this basket is all your beliefs, and you empty it out and you try to only put back in there what you're 100% sure this is a good apple, and you end up with very, very little, because that's not a productive or constructive way of acquiring knowledge. So even the modern skepticism or Cartesian skepticism leads to the same kind of problems. So how do we distinguish between reasonable skepticism versus radical skepticism? Because of course a person will say, isn't it reasonable to be skeptical about something? For example, people mention things like monster under the bed, tooth fairy, unicorns, or whatever. And of course, it's reasonable to be skeptical about something that doesn't make sense based on our collective knowledge and experience. Mm-hmm. But it is unreasonable and indeed radical to be skeptical about something that our entire understanding of reality rests upon, right? So something like belief in the external world or belief in morality, that is where it becomes radical skepticism, because those are the roots. So if you're looking at a tree, you have the inferential knowledge, which are the branches of the tree that grow out from the trunk and the roots. And, maybe the branches get too long in one direction or another, and you say, well, this is now getting unreasonable, and I'm going to trim this branch here and there. But you don't try to uproot the entire tree or cut down the entire tree. And what I'm explaining is that all of the roots are themselves tied to the deepest root, which is the theocentric worldview. That is what is the soil in which it nourishes the entire tree. The tree has to grow in that. And the Quran, of course, in chapter 14 gives us the example of the tree of faith that is firmly grounded, right? It's firmly grounded in Iman, and then it has these fruits that it delivers. And those are the fruits of the good deeds and all the actions of virtue that come out from that. So that's the difference between reasonable versus radical skepticism. Now, safsata or radical skepticism was, of course, a phenomenon that was recognized by Muslim scholars and discussed in great detail in a variety of works. And the word safsata, which I'm translating as radical skepticism, if you want to be more specific about it, you could say it's an Arabicization of the Greek word sophist. However, it was used to signify the trend of radical skepticism. And that's not an accident, because if you actually look at the Greek sophists, you look at figures like Protagoras and Gorgias and others, you can see there is radical skepticism in their ideas as well. For example, Protagoras, in the statement, man is the measure of all things, and how that relates to the idea of relativizing knowledge. So there is an element of radical skepticism there. The early historian al-Yaqubi, he identified the radical skeptics or Sophistaiya as a group among the Greeks who denied knowledge due to the presence of epistemic disagreement. So you believe something, you meet somebody who believes something else, and now you have to be in a state of skepticism. And what's really interesting is Al-Farabi, the Arab philosopher, identifies them with the thought of the Greek philosopher Pyrrho of Elis. And that's really interesting, because that is a major topic in the article that I wrote. And also, Pyrrhonian skepticism is really the skepticism that best illustrates safsata and really shows the problems with this epistemology. And of course, other scholars in Islamic tradition mention there are levels of skepticism. People don't, all get to the same level of doubting and denying and asserting the impossibility of knowledge about something. And they mention there's different subgroups. So you have inadiyya, those who obstinately deny objective reality. You have indiyya, those who deem reality dependent upon one's beliefs, which are relativists, and you have la adriya, those who say la adri, I don't know, those who negate knowledge of objective reality. So you could say the atheists are the inadiyya when it comes to radical skepticism about God, versus the agnostics are the la adriya, right? And there are others who are just relativists. They say it doesn't really matter what you believe about God's existence. So these are, the categories of safsata. And I want to hone in on this point about Pyrrho of Elis and why it's so significant, because Pyrrho of Elis is this Greek thinker who took radical skepticism to its logical conclusion. He tried to live his life according to radical skepticism and just doubt everything. And there's a variety of humorous anecdotes, who knows if they're true or not, but they really illustrate just how extreme his radical skepticism was. Tales of him almost walking off of a cliff, or, because his students would have to restrain him, and he'd say, well, I see a cliff, but how do I know for sure? What if I'm hallucinating, right? Mm-hmm. Or he would walk into barking dogs or moving wagons, and he'd say, well, how do I know it's a dog? How do I not know it's a cat, right? Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting thought experiment, and the Rational Wiki has an example of this about what would it be like to live your life as a Pyrrhonian skeptic. And, when you wake up in the morning, you have to say, did I really just wake up? How do I know I was ever asleep? How do I know that someone didn't erase my memories while I was asleep? How do I know that being asleep or being awake are even two different states? How do I know my real name? How do I know I'm the same person I was yesterday? And it goes on and on and on. You wouldn't even be able to get out of bed. You wouldn't be able to have any coherent thoughts about anything. So clearly, it doesn't make sense for a person to live their life as a radical skeptic, as a Pyrrhonian skeptic. And we recognize that when you try to apply that standard to everything. The problem is people seem to neglect that or forget that when they apply that kind of radical skepticism to belief in God's existence. Now, there's some really interesting discussions from Ludwig Wittgenstein, who talked about epistemology, and Duncan Pritchard, contemporary academic on the epistemology of religious belief. He's shown that these discussions were inspired actually by discussions on the epistemology of religious belief from John Henry Newman. And Wittgenstein read this, and he kind of came up with an epistemology that explained why radical skepticism doesn't make sense.
Is that the Grammar of Assent by John Henry Newman?
That's right. That's the Grammar of Assent by John Henry Newman.
A brilliant book. When I was a Catholic, I was very impressed with that, I must say. He's an extraordinary writer. Anyway, that's beside the point.
So that had a profound influence on Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein, he wrote these notebooks, a set of notebooks towards the end of his life, which were collected in this work called Uncertainty. And in this work, Uncertainty, he talks about how if you tried to doubt everything, you would not get as far as doubting anything, because the game of doubting itself presupposes certainty. He gives an example of a teacher who's teaching a student, and everything the teacher says, the student objects to it and says, well, how do you know that? What's your proof for that? What's your proof for that? And the teacher can't explain anything to the student, and the student won't learn anything. And he says this is analogous to somebody who is looking for something and they keep opening the same drawer. Such a person has not even learned how to look for something. And in the same way, such a student has not even learned how to learn. So there is an epistemology we need to have in order to acquire knowledge. And he gives this analogy where he says the questions that we raise and our doubts depend on the fact that some propositions are exempt from doubts. They are, as it were, like hinges on which those doubts turn, on which our rational evaluation turns. So he gives the example of the hinge of a door, right? So the door is your aql, your rationality, your rational evaluation of everything. In order for that rational evaluation to even work, you have to have certain fundamental convictions in place in order to make sense of anything. If you try to take those convictions off, you literally become unhinged, right? Your door is no longer attached to anything. The door doesn't work.
You don't mention them, maybe you will, but we're talking here about presumably the intelligibility of the universe, the existence of the external world, causality, these things you've already Those are kind of things.
Those are the Hinge commitments, exactly. So the things that we talked about as fundamental axioms in order for human rationality to work. So Duncan Pritchard has explained this as Wittgensteinian Hinge epistemology, the idea that there are certain fundamental convictions that the human being needs to have in order to engage in reason, like the hinge for the door to turn. And of course, there are lots of similarities between this and what Ibn Taymiyyah mentions, as I talk about in the article. One thing I will say, there's an important difference as well, which is that in Pritchard's construction of Wittgensteinian Hinge epistemology, the hinges themselves are irrational. They're not subject to rational evaluation. But Ibn Taymiyyah is very clear that you can evaluate those hinge commitments, your fundamental religious worldview. You can understand whether it's rational or not based on how well it functions in producing meaning, based on how well it functions in delivering truths, based on how well it functions in delivering virtue and leading to guidance and leading to further knowledge and growth in knowledge. So we could say that if the hinge is no longer working well, that's when you have to abandon it or replace it with another hinge. And that's why people abandon one religious worldview and adopt another, right? And that's why people convert to Islam. They realize the hinges they've got are not moving the door correctly. And that's why people find the Islamic worldview compelling, because it provides those hinges that are actually needed and necessary in order to move the door of rational evaluation, to provide a meaningful outlook on reality. So Ibn Taymiyyah, it comes in this tradition that has been describing safsata or radical skepticism, and he makes two significant contributions that are at least in my research, are novel. The first is that he describes atheism as a form of radical skepticism specifically. And he also reconceptualizes safsata itself and the radical skepticism. And he explains this is not a particular faction of people. It's not some group of people who were just, weirdos who said, hey, we want to doubt the existence of the world around us or doubt that our senses are reliable. He said, instead, radical skepticism is a broader psychological phenomenon, and people can localize it to specific topics that they choose to doubt, but it's a broader psychological phenomenon that occurs and is encountered by people in different domains. And that's really important because it'll connect with something that I'm going to point out shortly. So let's look at how he articulates this. So he explains that atheism is a form of radical skepticism. So he says that belief in the existence of God is something that is even more foundational to the Fitra than belief in widely attested events or historical facts or knowledge of foreign cities or nations. So, for example, if I sitting here said, well, you know what, I've never been to London, I don't believe London exists, right? If I said that kind of thing and I tell you, Paul, you've got to give me philosophical proof that London exists or else I'm not going to believe in it. You say, well, look at these pictures. I say, oh, it's all artificial intelligence, it's ChatGPT, it's all made up, right? People would recognize that's irrational. Denying widely attested events or historical facts is irrational. He's saying that denying the existence of God is an even greater type of radical skepticism because the existence of God is even more firmly embedded within the Fitra in comparison to these other types of knowledge. And in fact, he says every thought that crosses the mind of the human being necessitates the divine. So really the proofs for God's existence are limitless. Every thought that occurs in your mind, if you were to ascribe meaning to that thought, what is that meaning grounded in? Without understanding God as the source of meaning, then really everything just collapses into nihilism, right? So there is no shortage and no end to the number of proofs for the existence of God. And denial of God's existence is the greatest form of radical skepticism, he says. And this is where I think it's really important that people look at what Ibn Taymiyyah says about the Fitra. But in order to understand his epistemology of religious belief, you have to understand that these are two sides of the same coin. The Fitra is the positive and the safsata is the negative. So whatever a person denies that is from the Fitra is a type of radical skepticism. Radical skepticism, Ibn Taymiyyah explains, is denying anything that is grounded within the Fitra, any knowledge that is grounded within the Fitra. So, this is something I will mention briefly. It's explained in much more detail in the article, so people can refer to that. But, people said, when the article was released, some people asked, well, you didn't explain how atheism is a form of radical skepticism. Well, in fact, there is a detailed chart there that kind of explains it in detail. So atheism is radical skepticism that looks at a limited domain. It's not general skepticism applied to everything. It applies it specifically to belief in God's existence. And it is theoretical in character. It says there's a lack of justification for God's existence. It criticizes the basis of belief in God by saying it's unproven. It's a priori doubt. For some people, it's unmitigated. It's saying that there's no basis to believe in God's existence, whereas some people are mitigated skeptics. And the persistence is constant for an atheist, right? Now, for somebody who's going through a crisis of faith, who's a believer, they may experience the same kind of radical skepticism, but for them, it may be variable. So some days they wake up and they think, well, I'm not really sure today what's going on, whether God exists or not. And some days they think, no, today I feel like it makes more sense. And they're stuck in the same loop of radical skepticism, but it hasn't pushed them to the same point of constant persistence, right? For them, it might be more variable. So that's exactly how atheism maps onto a classification of radical skepticism. And now we want to conclude the Qur'anic alternative. So we've looked at radical skepticism, why it doesn't work as an epistemology. Now we want to go from doubt to certainty. So how do we embrace the Qur'anic alternative? And here what I want to lead us towards is this idea that there's a teleological dimension of truth. So one of the things that a person will notice, the Quran uses the word haqq for truth and batil for falsehood. And what's interesting about the way the Quran uses these words, the word haqq is also used to signify something having a purpose, right? God mentions in the Quran, خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بِالْحَقِّ. He created the heavens and the earth in truth, also with a purpose. وَمَا خَلَقَنَا السَّمَاءَ وَالْأَرْضَ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا بَاطِلًا. We didn't create the heavens and the earth, batil meaning without any purpose. So the idea that there is a teleological dimension to truth. Something that's true means that it also serves a purpose. So when you acquire a truth serves to guide one to higher states of knowledge and greater states of virtuous actions. True beliefs serve as paradigms for rendering reality meaningful, as scaffolding for new learning and deeper realizations. So this is a constructive approach to knowledge. And evaluating the rationality of belief should look at not asking, well, what is one other fact that proves why you believe this, and going in a retrograde process of justification, but to go in an anterograde process by looking at where do these beliefs lead? What does this lead to a understanding of reality that is true and meaningful? Because of course, the retrograde process of justification, it gets into this problem called Munchausen's trilemma. So if you say, why do you believe something? And I tell you because of this proof. And then you say, well, how do you know that's true? And I say, because of this proof. And you say, how do you know that's true? Now there's three options. Either the proofs go on infinitely, that's called infinitism. And since nobody possesses an infinite number of proofs, nobody knows anything. Or the proofs go to some arbitrary stopping point and we say, we're just not going to question that. And that's called foundationalism. Or the proofs kind of support one another in a circular fashion. And that's called coherentism. And Muslim scholars recognize the problems of these different options, but what is not mentioned in the Munchausen's trilemma is that all of these three options presuppose certain concepts. They presuppose the concept of truth, they presuppose the concept of knowledge, they presuppose the concept of belief, they presuppose the concept of proof, they presuppose the concept of meaning. So to even pose Munchausen's trilemma, you have to have these concepts already there. Where did those concepts come from? They come from the Fitra. So when we look at an anterograde line of justification, we say, how does this idea or concept impact my view of reality? How does it make sense of my existence and experience? What does it teach me? How does it make me a better person? How does it guide me? What does it lead me towards? And here we can point out that a revealed truth is more than a simple theoretical proposition. And this ties back to something I mentioned at the beginning. Belief in God is far deeper and more meaningful than this kind of mundane idea of, belief that I have 3 coins in my pocket, right? It's much deeper than just a kind of simple theoretical propositional truth. It presents a paradigm for interpreting reality in a meaningful way. It shapes the way we interpret concepts like right and wrong. It explains how we understand our existence, what makes our life worth living. So philosopher John Whitaker writes, "For the point of presenting religious beliefs as revelations is to present them as conceptual truths, as practical axioms of life, as ruling principles that frame new conceptions of worth, happiness, and selfhood. And this puts them into a different logical category than the basket that holds hypothetical claims." And if we talk about this, in terms of the theocentric worldview, the question comes, how does belief in God provide us with the conceptual foundation for interpreting reality in a meaningful way? So C. Stephen Evans, he writes, "It is important to see that the question of God's reality is a question about the character of the whole of reality. God is not just one more thing. If God exists, then there is a spiritual and moral purpose at the bottom of the whole of reality. If God does not exist, then this is not the case." While Halak mentions about the Qur'anic worldview, he says, "I contend that the Quran has provided Muslim believers with a cosmology entirely grounded in moral natural laws, a cosmology with perhaps far more persuasive power than any of its Enlightenment metaphysical counterparts, and one that had powerful and deep psychological effects." So there's this understanding that a theocentric worldview is foundational to to the way that we interpret reality. It's much deeper than just looking at God's existence as some hypothetical claim. And now Ibn Taymiyyah mentions this, actually. If we go all the way back 7 centuries, Ibn Taymiyyah explains that God is the foundation of our understanding. He says, "Since Allah, glorified be He, is the first who created all beings in existence." And here he's referring to the divine name Al-Awwal, right? That God is the first. The Quran mentions that He is Al-Awwal wal-Akhir, right? He is the first and the last. He is the first who created all beings in existence, and He is the last to whom all originated entities return. He is therefore the all-encompassing foundation. So ontologically, God is the basis of all reality. God is the source of all existence, ontologically. In the same way, knowledge of Him is the foundation of all knowledge, and it's encompassing reality, right? So just as God is ontologically the foundation and has ontological priority, He also has epistemological priority. And mentioning Him is the foundation of all speech, and it's encompassing reality. And acting for Him is the foundation of all action, and it's encompassing reality. So God also has ethical priority, right? So this is something that in my doctoral work, I call this theocentric axiology. Our entire structure of values is rooted in this theocentric worldview. Ontology, epistemology, ethics, everything has God as the starting point. And that's the foundation for understanding reality in a meaningful way. There is no righteousness for the creation except in knowing their Lord and worshiping Him. So when we come to this question of what is the best answer to life, we need a way of life that gives us a meaningful account of the essential elements of human existence. So every human being asks these big questions. They might have questions about intellectual questions about life. Why is the universe comprehensible? Why is it that we have minds that are capable of deciphering truths about the universe? Where do these truths and what is the basis for the truths of reality? What are these truths grounded in? And then there are moral questions that people might have. How do I know there is such a thing as good and bad? Are moral values real? And we intuitively know that they are. And there should be some significance to behaving with virtue. And then there are spiritual questions. What makes life worth living? What makes my existence matter? And so if people don't have a meaningful account of reality, when they encounter these different questions, they're going to end up with this kind of meaning crisis. So I referred to the psychologist John Vervaeke's series before, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So he says, we are a culture that is very belief-centric, And what he means here is that propositional sense of the term. We have reduced knowledge to the notion of justified true belief, but there's much more to knowing, and much of therapy is trying to recover a lost sense of what it means to know. And he has this question that he asks his students. He says, where do you go to look up information? The internet. Where do you go for knowledge of science, scientists? Where do you go for biology, biologists, doctors, medicine doctors, right? And so on and so forth. And then when he asks them, where do you go for wisdom? There's silence in the class. And he explains that wisdom is the process of rescuing meaning. And traditionally, religions were those sources of providing meaning. And meaning is this process of relevance realization. It's pre-conceptual, it's pre-logical. It is constitutive of being an intelligent agent in a meaningful world. So we have to have a system that addresses this and provides us with a meaningful account of reality. So how does Tawheed do this? How does the Qur'anic understanding of God's oneness, Islamic monotheism, a divine oneness, how does that provide us with that all-encompassing paradigm? Well, when we look at the intellectual journey, and we look at the intellectual questions a human being has, why do I have this mind that is capable of deciphering truths? We recognize that life is a journey to understand the signs of God in nature and scripture. Ayat al-Kawniyya and Ayat al-Qur'aniyya. That intellectual capacity or that epistemic capacity is directly connected to our moral and spiritual journey as well. The moral journey is life is a journey to come closer to God by engaging in worship of Him, by engaging in righteous deeds, taking care of the rights of the creation, fulfilling our duty as moral custodians on this earth. And there's the spiritual journey, that life is a journey to deepen our relationship with God, to fill our hearts with His love, to worship Him alone, to engage in spiritual purification through our actions. What's interesting is the scholar Ar-Raghib al-Asfahani, a Qur'anic scholar, he mentions what is the reason that God created the creation, and he mentions three things which correspond with these three domains of questions that I'm outlining here. So he says we have ibadah, worship, which is that spiritual journey. He says we have khilafah, the idea that God has appointed human beings as moral custodians, as a vicegerent on this earth. And he says we have imaratul ard, this idea that we are tasked with contributing constructively to the building and development of the earth and to civilization. And that is that intellectual journey. So that is the divine project for human beings. That is the divinely ordained mission and task and purpose for our life. And so on the Tawheed paradigm, everything in life is filled with meaning. Everything is part of that journey. Whereas when you compare it with the materialist paradigm, everything is ultimately meaningless. All of our actions, emotions, aspirations are nothing more than the amalgamation of chemical processes that ultimately go back to fundamental forces of physics that exist reasonlessly, as we mentioned, that whole issue. So Tawheed is the only view that fundamentally gives us meaning and makes sense. That idea of sense making is really what we're looking for, which is the idea that Allah is the creator of everything. He created us for a purpose, to worship Him, to do righteous deeds, and we will return back to Him. We will be accountable in the next life. There is no other view that logically explains our purpose in life, the reality of our existence, the nature of the choice between good and bad, and so on. So just to kind of conclude here, every human being has the choice between pursuing what is meaningful or turning away from it. The message of Islam provides us with a meaningful, rational, succinct, and clear understanding of existence, and Islam's theocentric worldview provides the foundations to understand the basic axioms of human thought. The Quran presents us with its own epistemology, which is not reliant on Hellenistic philosophy and does not fall prey to radical skepticism. There's the whole discussion of decolonizing knowledge, right? That comes up, right? And I know you've had Professor Joseph Lombard talk about decolonizing our epistemology. Yeah. So this falls entirely in line with that project. If we're going to decolonize our epistemology, let's look at the Qur'an's epistemology, the Qur'anic epistemology that is not reliant on, ideologies that fall prey to radical skepticism and incoherence. And the outcome from this presentation, from this whole discourse, hopefully, is that when we talk about presenting Islam to outsiders, or we talk about how this should impact the Dawah scene, people should not take an approach that's just going to further induce and contribute and incite doubt, right? And entertain doubt. Instead, the focus should be on presenting the message of Islam rather than seeking external confirmation through appeals to convoluted arguments. Present the message of Islam and let the person's fitra do the work, and show them the meaningful nature of Islam's explanation for reality. And when the focus for Muslims is looking at our Qur'anic worldview, trying to better understand our Qur'anic worldview and how it calls us to righteousness, to virtue in all domains of life, and using that to seek the path of guidance, striving for divine pleasure and for moral and spiritual growth on the path of virtue. So that, in a nutshell, kind of summarizes everything. Of course, if people are interested in more references and more information, there is the article to check out.
Exactly. The article, Atheism and Radical Skepticism, Ibn Taymiyyah's Epistemic Critique, is in the link in the description below. Please do have a look at it. And there are many other articles, obviously, you've written for your keen, fascinating articles, actually. There's a treasure trove of juicy stuff there. So do have a look around at those articles as well. So thank you very much, indeed, Dr. Nazir Khan, for your expertise, your time, your inexhaustible energy to talk about this for 2 hours. It's been absolutely fascinating. And it's extremely relevant to our Dawah work as well, obviously. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Paul, again for the invitation. And I enjoyed very much the conversation and appreciate it once again.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. Till next time. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care. Salam.